the current Washington State athletic director has just made it clear that, well, they're thinking about anything and everything.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth: realignment, coaching, carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. We'll talk with Brian Smith about whether Ohio State can keep the number one recruiting class in the country. They've got it right now for 2025. And Wisconsin's most important game or games. That's coming up on today's show. But we start with our good friends in the Pac-12. So Anne McCoy is currently the interim athletic director at Washington State because Pat Chun left to go to their arch rival Washington. I imagine that didn't land very well with the fans up in Pullman. The search is on. She is a candidate to replace him. And she was talking on John Canzano's radio show recently about, how she's handling all of this. And she said something that really caught my attention. Hence the segment on today's show. She was asked about, what next steps are and how do you plot your move and what's it going to look like and how are you going to do this? And she said, well, we have to be prepared to go forward with all sorts of options, whether that's a merger with the Mountain West, whether that's a reverse merger in which the Mountain West goes away but then plays under the label of the Pac-12, or whether that's, joining a new conference, that'd be Big 12 or ACC, or whether that would be putting together something that doesn't currently exist. That was the gist of what she said. And I heard that and went, hold on, the what now? The what? The consensus options for the Pac-12, that being Oregon State and Washington State, are join the Big 12 or ACC or rebuild the Pac-12. But then there was this third thing she said, which was putting together something that doesn't exist right now or that we don't have or making something new. And I thought, well, what on earth could that possibly be? And then I thought about my idea, which is rebuild the Pac-12 with the best of the Mountain West and some of the American Conference. Now, she'd have to square that with her president, Kirk Schultz, who has been publicly on the record saying he believes there should be a premier West Coast-based conference. That would more line up with a reverse merger or a merger with the Mountain West in making that league into the best that it can possibly be. And I don't know that adding every single team from the Mountain West is the way to do that. What I do know is that the Pac-12 has got a lot of options available to it, and they're clearly considering all of them. And I think that, whether or not Anne McCoy gets the athletic director job, I think that her comments are reflecting the mindset that Oregon State and Washington State should have, which is don't pigeonhole yourself into we have to do this or it has to be that. It has to be this. Yeah, they're waiting on what's going to happen here with the ACC. I think they've got some time. I think they can let this thing play out over there and see how the conference progresses and what teams could become available. But I think that Kirk Schultz is a little bit misguided. I can appreciate where he is coming from. I can understand and value his comment regarding a premier West Coast league. I just think if you are actually acting in the best interest of the conference that you're trying to build, you can't get pigeonholed with geography. You just can't. There are schools out west that would make a lot of sense. If Stanford and Cal became available again, of course you'd take them. If SMU was suddenly on the market, of course you'd take them. Boise State, Fresno State, San Diego State, those feel like automatic, no doubt about it, probably UNLV, no-brainer additions to start with, and then you'd evaluate your candidates from there. But to say that you're going to just ignore the possibility of adding a school like Tulane or UTSA or Memphis or even going all the way across the country to South Florida, who I talked recently on the show that I have my doubts they could be an actual candidate to replace Florida State in the ACC if the Seminoles are able to leave the league. But I just don't think you can narrow yourself, because if you're trying to create the premier group of 5 conference, which is what I have suggested, and I think that's what Anne McCoy was getting at. They didn't go into details or specifics, but she said, well, and something, or whether it's something else that doesn't yet exist. Well, that would probably be a reconstructed Pac-12 that isn't just building with Mountain West teams. And I imagine that comment being left deliberately vague and not expanded upon is to not feel like you're throwing a shot across the bow or working behind the backs of the Mountain West, who you currently have a scheduling arrangement with. I mean, 7 games a year for Oregon State and Washington State against the Mountain West. That's a win-win both ways, because you need the best caliber of competition that you can find if you're the Beavs and the Cougs, and the Mountain West is always down to play teams of the highest caliber that they can find. Not just because of the exposure it gets them, but the opportunity to win a quality game. And Oregon State and Washington State, in the eyes of our friends at FanDuel, are going to be quality teams this year. Their win totals are set at 7.5. The only higher win total in the Mountain West is Boise State, the Mountain West favorites, at 8.5. And I don't know if Boise State has a schedule that's quite as difficult as Oregon State and Washington State, because they've got more power opponents on there. But certainly Boise has got a pretty good schedule. They have to go to Oregon the second week of the season. Oregon State gets to host Oregon the following week. But I just found those comments to be really telling, that they're truly considering every single option. And if you want to go into the YouTube comments and guess which one is going to happen, you be my guest. The reason that I understand the positioning, and I've talked recently here on the show about how Oregon State and Washington State should be marketing themselves in a way that is kind of serving as a de facto audition for the Big 12 or the ACC. There is another side of that coin that it should be brought to the forefront, which is that if they were to leave the Pac-12, I'm not sure what would happen with the settlement money they got from the 10 departing schools. Now, if they were in the Big 12 or the ACC, perhaps that wouldn't be a concern for them. Perhaps they would just say, you know what, this is too valuable of an opportunity. And yeah, we had these, hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was totaling like around 200 or so. And yep, we'll just give that back to the other schools and take whatever we can get going to the Big 12 or ACC and keep our seat at the table. Perhaps they would see that as more valuable. I mean, with their television arrangement that they got with the CW and Fox Sports for their upcoming games this year, they valued exposure over revenue. Now, that was a short-term play. Conference affiliation, that's more of a long-term play, where you have to consider both sides of that, right? You're trying to keep yourself as visible as possible in the college football landscape. You also have to keep your athletic department funded at a certain level, lest you have to make cuts or just not be able to make yourselves competitive with the coaching with the coaching salaries that you're able to offer. And that can be a difficult situation. Certainly Oregon State especially has felt the brunt of that this offseason. Jonathan Smith left, and a bunch of other athletes have left because the financial opportunities at Oregon State are not as plentiful as they are elsewhere in the eyes of those particular individuals. So I think considering all options is really smart. I still think there is legitimate value and the maximum amount of playoff access, by the way, if you build the best Group of 5 conference in the country. If you weaken the American and you weaken the Mountain West, and everyone's looking to you and saying your conference has got the essential auto G5 berth, because if you go 11-2 on that schedule, that's going to be better than anything another G5 could likely put together. I still think that's the best play. Certainly, though, it is not the only play. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter, at @SMcLaughlinCFB. We're going to talk Ohio State next, because they have the #1 recruiting class in the country. That's pretty impressive. Can they keep it there? Well, it'll depend on a couple things. Coming up next. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Game Time makes getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. You can save up to 60%, which is over half, Just letting that sink in. Buying last minute for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you want. They've got their lowest price guarantee, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA Finals tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. The top recruiting class in 2025 currently belongs to Ohio State. Can it stay that way? Brian Smith, our Lockdown Recruiting Insider here, joining me on the show, brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. Can the Buckeyes hold on to that top spot for the next cycle, Brian?
I think they can, but there's still a lot of battles to win. Obviously, getting Delane is great. He may be the best safety / he could probably play corner in the country. They got Sanchez. They got a lot of great players committed. Naeem Offord. But how many of those guys do they keep? Like, I think Auburn could flip Naeem Offord. He might be the best corner in the country. And there are a lot of other recruitments they're still involved with too. So Georgia's a threat. I think they're the most likely to finish number one, honestly. Alabama's always a threat. LSU's got Bryce Underwood. It's going to be a very close race.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it has been a hot minute since any team outside the SEC pulled in the number one recruiting class. Am I correct in assessing that? Or who was the last to do it?
Because the last time it happened, I'm sure.
Yeah, it just feels like they're starting to make some inroads, they being everybody else. Not that the SEC isn't going to still dominate recruiting. You look at the top 10 classes, you still have Alabama in there. Oh, what a surprise. You have Oklahoma, you've got Auburn in there, LSU. But there are some other big-time programs that are pushing for that top class and will push for the top class. If I told you right now it was not an SEC team, but not Ohio State, that finishes with the number one class in the 2025 cycle, who would you pick right now?
It's not realistic, really. It's going to be one or the other, but Oregon and Notre Dame would be the only ones off the top of my head. Possibly, maybe Florida State. They'd have to hit an inside straight. Those would be the only possibilities. But really, the number one spot is relegated to about 5 schools. We all know who they are. It's not shocking. It's LSU, Bama, Georgia, Ohio State. That's pretty much it. Clemson doesn't sign normally enough high school kids to get ranked number one, but they do a great job with the players they sign. Maybe Texas, but now they're in the SEC, so that doesn't count anymore because they used to be Big 12. That's about it. The number between like 4 and 10, that fluctuates all over the place, but the schools I just mentioned are probably about it.
When you look at this Ohio State class right now, it's certainly going to grow. You could have a decommitment or two. I know that Naeem Offord in particular is getting a lot of interest from other schools, but what is it about this class that impresses you the most? Not just the players that are in it, but the way that it's been put together so far by Ryan Day and his staff.
First off, you got to talk about the corners. I've seen Offord and I've seen Sanchez play. I think they're the two best corners probably in the country. To get the two best in one class is as rare as it gets. These are the kind of guys that can come in and play right away at Ohio State. 6'1" and 6'2". They have the smooth, fluid motion. Those guys are going to play early for the Buckeyes. Then you just kind of look at the class as a whole. They got balance. They've got, they need a little more up front on the offensive line, but like they've got really good players and they got some key visits coming up at the end of the month. There's no reason they should finish outside the top 5 at worst, and they legitimately have a chance to finish number 1.
One of the big questions when Kalen DeBoer took the Alabama job was, well, he didn't recruit much up at Washington, which is true. Relative to Washington's recruiting potential, he didn't do hardly anything. There were a lot of players there, and then he brought in a couple guys via the portal, and that was that. And then he just is a really, really good in-game coach. But one of the, I think, fair questions was, how's he going to recruit now that he's at Alabama? And he lost his offensive line coach and offensive coordinator to my beloved Seahawks in the NFL, Brian, and yet here he is. It's still June. A lot can change, but if you didn't know, if you went away from college football and didn't consume any news for the last 6 months, you'd probably think Nick Saban was still there because, they're sitting in the top 5 right now. How is DeBoer and his staff, how are they being received on the trail?
It is a mixed bag. They've gotten some elite recruits, and they've also screwed up some recruitments when they first started to process. They didn't pick up the pieces the way they should. But here lately, they've caught fire. I don't know exactly what it is, but a couple of things to think about. Number one, this is Alabama. My dead grandmother could recruit to Alabama, okay? It's not hard. If you've ever been to their facilities, I have. You've lived in the state, I have, etc. They do not stop talking about Alabama football at 3 a.m. Like, it just does not stop. This state, though, is still up for grabs a little bit. Auburn's made a push. They got a top 10 class, too. They lost the offer. They still got potential to flip some kids that they're working on. They could end up with the top class after a really awkward start. I don't know how to rank it, though, overall in terms of the effort, because they're still putting everything together and getting familiar with each other. You got to remember, a lot of that staff, they're West Coast guys. So I have no idea how well they're going to do down the stretch when they got to try to knock off Kirby for a key recruit in the state of Georgia or something like that. Alabama commonly beats everybody in those. We don't know where they're going to go recruitments. Nick always won those. Is that going to be the case with Kalen DeBoer? I need to see it. But overall, I think they're a little bit ahead of where I had them not too long ago because they caught fire once again.
Let's talk about USC because they have been ratcheting up their efforts on the recruiting trail. I don't think it's accidental or by coincidence that after Alex Grinch gets fired, suddenly USC is in on more high-profile defensive recruits, and their overall recruiting efforts are ticking up a notch. Because frankly, the last couple of classes under Lincoln Riley, they haven't been bad, but they have been nowhere near USC's full potential if they are recruiting at their very best, because they have so much talent just right there in their backyard. You look up and USC's recruiting rankings right now in the class of 25, and certainly there's a lot of fluctuation because kids are taking visits and committing, decommitting, and doing all sorts of stuff right now. But USC's class ranking has actually dropped down on 24/7 Sports to the 6th class in the country. What do you think USC is doing right now to find so much success?
NIL, hiring a great defensive coordinator, and your USC. At some point, if you hire the right coaches, USC is a pretty easy sell. I don't think we've ever worried about them signing wide receivers, running backs, or quarterbacks. That's not going to change. But now that you've got a real DC, it's amazing how, like you said at the beginning here at this segment, they're getting defensive linemen to visit. They're getting linebackers. They're getting, say, all the kids that were going, bye-bye, I'm going to the SEC, or I'm going to Oklahoma, whatever it was in the last couple of years. Now they're getting those kids to visit, some of them to commit. Now, there's a lot of NIL going on here for some of these kids, and I still need to see it finalized because they got a lot of Southeastern kids. I need to see that on signing day before I'll buy it. Yeah, I'm a big disbeliever in kids from Deep South ending up in LA. It's not a good cultural fit, but that's where the great defensive players mostly are. So I get why they're trying. I need to see that finalized, but they've gotten them all on campus, and they've got a bunch of visits coming up that are humongous. Not only for them, but for a lot of SEC schools like Auburn, Alabama, Georgia, LSU. Yeah,
Elijah Griffin is one of those names, 5-star defensive lineman amongst others. And I'll get you out of here on this, Brian. Can USC have a top 5 class this year with the way other teams are looking? You have Georgia in the mix. We talked about Ohio State, and Alabama's there. Notre Dame has been knocking their recruiting out of the park. Oregon has been recruiting at a high level. Is USC with Lincoln Riley capable of breaking through and pulling in a top 5 class?
As long as Julian Lewis sticks with them and doesn't flip to Auburn, which that's right now really hard to see. It's pretty cloudy. There's a chance for it. It's going to come down to those Southeastern kids because they're finally getting some of the California kids to come back in the fold. They'd struggled here recently, but they're also going to have to land one of the kids in California they may not lead for right now. It's hard for me to say that because when I was growing up, they didn't lose many of those battles for like the kids from Mater Dei, et cetera. Oregon and Alabama and several other schools. Penn State just got a Mater Dei kid. I mean, like that.
Penn State got a Mater Dei kid?
Yeah, a corner that was highly coveted. So it's just wild. They can't continue.
That's a heck of a pull. That's a long trip.
Yeah, like in my life, they've never gotten a kid like that from California that I remember. And I started following recruiting around 1990. So that's a long time. But look, USC's on that cusp. Like the change in recruiting on the defensive side is massive. Congrats to them, but now they still got to finish.
Brian Smith, Locked On Recruiting Insider here at the network, brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Brian, thank you as always.
Absolutely, sir.
Wisconsin has got a lot of big games, has got a challenging schedule in 2024. What's their most important game? We'll talk about that next. Might not be what you think. So when you look through Wisconsin's schedule, there are a lot of tough games. I mean, a lot of tough games. Sometimes when you look at a team's win total on FanDuel and you see 6.5, you think, oh, okay, they could, maybe be an 8-9 win team if everything goes really well, but they're probably just, happy to be bowl eligible and whatnot. That doesn't always speak to the caliber of team that a coach is actually dealing with. It might just speak to the schedule that he's got. And that's an important thing to consider when you're looking at these win totals, because not all schedules are created equal. I talked about Virginia Tech's schedule on yesterday's show because their win total recently got bumped from 7.5 to 8.5. The same as NC State's, who people see as kind of a dark horse or maybe not so dark horse ACC title contender. If you gave Wisconsin either of those teams' schedules, particularly Va Tech's, would their win total still be 6.5, or would it be a little bit higher? Here's why. They start with Western Michigan, South Dakota. Those are going to be wins. Then they have a marquee game against Alabama. Now, you may be saying, Spencer, you're talking about the most important game on Wisconsin's schedule. It's got to be that game against Alabama, right? Nope, I do not believe so. Remember, recently on this show, I talked with Ryan Herrings of Locked On Badgers about what a good season looks like, what the best season could look like for this Wisconsin team. This is still just year 2 for Luke Fickell. He's got Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback and, a good roster to be sure. But is it one of the best in the Big Ten? Should they expect to be Big Ten title contenders? No, we said their ceiling was 9-3 with this schedule, which is absolutely brutal because, you get your first 3 games at home. You get a couple of tune-ups, and then you get to take on the Crimson Tide. It's year 1 for Kalen DeBoer, but I'm not picking against Alabama in that particular game. I don't have too many selections on individual games of that caliber right now, like Florida-Miami. I don't know who I'd pick right now. Maybe I'd lean towards Miami, but am I making that officially? No. I'm not picking against Alabama in that particular game, even though it is in Madison and Camp Randall is going to be a rockin'. It is going to be rockin' for the Crimson Tide. Then the next week, they have a bye before they go at USC and begin a stretch of 3 road games in their next 4. So they get all this home cooking, but then the averages kind of catch up with them, and they have to go at USC, host Purdue. You better win that Purdue game, at Rutgers and at Northwestern. And here is why I am saying either the Rutgers or the Northwestern game is the key to Wisconsin's season. If they're going to be an 8-win team, they have to win at least one of those games. Between Alabama and USC, you're losing at least one. I think you're probably losing 2. And I haven't even gotten to the back half of their schedule, which has got Penn State at home. It's got Iowa on the road. It's got Oregon at home. It's got Nebraska on the road in consecutive weeks. Consecutive weeks. I don't know how much tougher of a Big Ten schedule you can devise here. Sure, Michigan's not on it, but every other Big Ten title contender is literally all of them in the odds market. Ohio State is first. They do not have Ohio State, admittedly. I got a little bit over my skis right there. But Oregon is second. You've got Penn State in there. They've got the 3rd or 4th best odds. You've got Iowa in there. That could be a pretty tough game to win because it's in Iowa City. That 4-game stretch, Penn State, at Iowa, Oregon, and at Nebraska, I think you're losing a couple of games there. So the Rutgers and the Northwestern games are key for 2 reasons. Number 1, they're just more winnable than some of the other games on Wisconsin's schedule. That's just a fact. They are among the most winnable games. And number 2, they're not going to be easy. And if you are able to win at least one, let's say they win both of those games on the road, they will have proven to themselves that they should have a sense of belief that they can go away from Camp Randall and win big games. If you win both of those contests in Piscataway and Evanston, which is not going to be an easy feat, by the way. Rutgers should be fighting to be a bowl team. Northwestern, capable of being a bowl team. How many games did Northwestern win last year? This is my favorite Big Ten pop quiz question from a season ago. Not just who led the conference in passing yards. What was Northwestern's record by the time bowl season came to a close? It was 8-5. It was 8-5. Do you remember that? Probably not. Do you look at Northwestern on the schedule and think, oh, that's probably a win? Well, David Braun has a good thing going. We'll see what their follow-up act is. I was pretty impressed with an 8-5 year following a 1-11 campaign. But if Wisconsin goes 3-0 in that stretch against Purdue, at Rutgers, and at Northwestern, how good do they have to be feeling? They should feel ecstatic, because they'll have no more than 2 losses at that point. If they manage to beat Alabama or USC, they're certainly in the top 25. But if they get through those first 7 games and they're sitting at 5-2, I think Wisconsin would be doing great. And suddenly, the homecoming game against Penn State on October 26th, suddenly that is a big, big time football game, because you'd only have 1 conference loss in that stretch. Because Alabama's a non-conference. USC, that's a member of the Big Ten. Who doesn't remember the days growing up with USC as a Big Ten team? That's what everybody's growing up in now, because that's what realignment has given us. But that stretch, I think they'll be able to beat Purdue at home. I don't have too many qualms about that. But at Rutgers, at Northwestern, consecutive weeks, they don't look that hard on paper. Their logos don't instill a lot of fear. But both of those games are going to be against teams that were in bowl games a season ago and expect to be in that same sort of discussion again this year. So that is why that stretch, and I said either of these games, I'm combining it to both. I'm altering the take mid-recording here because I'm realizing that makes the most sense. Those 2 games, I can see a world in which Wisconsin loses both of those games, in which case they could be in store for a 4 or 5 win season, because the back half gets insanely tough. But there is something to be said, even though you only play a college football game once a week, about the momentum that you generate and what a win does and how you're feeling and what happens here, how you win this game there, and what it does to a locker room. How good is that locker room going to feel if they go all the way to Piscataway and then they go down to Evanston and they win in back-to-back weeks following a win against Purdue? If they've got a win against USC already, holy smokes, they're going to be really feeling themselves up there in Madison. But if they go through that 3-game stretch and win all 3 and carry that into the Penn State game, that Penn State team is good. They're playoff caliber. But it's at home. Before the 4th quarter starts, they're going to be jumping around. And that football team will be playing with a supreme level of confidence. This will probably come down to how Tyler Van Dyke is able to mesh with Luke Fickell's system coming over from Miami in the offseason. That's going to be a big part of what defines this Wisconsin team, as is often the case. What do they get from the quarterback position? When they get high-level quarterback play, Wisconsin's usually a high-level team. That's been the standard no matter who the head coach has been. Brett Bielema, Paul Chryst, now Luke Fickell. That Penn State game, that's a big circle game, because then they have to go at Iowa, host Oregon, at Nebraska. Wisconsin could go 0-4 in that stretch, or they could go 3-1 in that stretch. It might depend on what they've done the weeks prior that determines how they are able to play on the field, how it is able to translate. Those 3 games, that's a big stretch. But Rutgers and Northwestern, the most important sequence on Wisconsin's schedule this year. That question came in. If you want me to break down a team's schedule like that about what's the most important game for their season, just let me know. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.